A lot of people think that homeschool is something that you do by yourself. And you, Jim, you probably know way more homeschooling families than I do, but I literally don't know any homeschooling family that sees themselves as on a journey alone, just me and my little house doing my little thing. It's everybody I know is doing it in some kind of way. They're doing it in community.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another edition of Homeschool Talks. And for those of you who don't know what Homeschool Talks is, it's where I get to talk to people in the homeschooling world who interest me. And if they interest me, I'm fairly certain that they'll interest you. And my guest today is very interesting to me. His name is Chris Butler, and he's up in Illinois. Are you in the storm? We're recording today. It's like 77 degrees down here in Virginia, and it's stormy and snowy up north.
So we're south of the city, and so we're getting rain, but not all of that snow and ice. So I'm glad about that.
So Chris came to my attention last year as he was running in the primaries for Congress in Illinois' 1st congressional district. And he's a homeschool dad and a pastor and has a very interesting biography. And so I thought, sadly, he didn't win the election, but I thought he sounds like a really interesting guy for us to talk to. So, Chris, why don't you tell us about yourself and how you and your family got involved in homeschooling?
Yeah, for sure. So, as you said, I am a pastor here in Chicago, and I've been doing that for about 7 years. Before that, was very much involved in kind of civics and kind of public affairs. Ran a public affairs consulting firm with my brother. And so that is a lot of where my ministry focus is at that intersection of sort of faith and civics, faith and politics. So that's sort of like how I live in my professional life. I think before my wife and I even started having children, we lived in Chicago. When we first got married, we were in youth ministry at our church in Englewood. We actually moved to Englewood so that we could be closer to the church, be closer to the young people, and have very much since the beginning of our marriage, very much felt a call to this city and to this region, and really want to do our ministry here. But at the same time, we kind of knew that we didn't want to put our kids in the schools here. A lot of the work that I've even done in the public space has been in the space of working to improve schools, to defend the rights of parents, to go into the schools and impact what's happening in the schools. I've done a lot of work on various school choice issues, charter schools. We don't have vouchers in Illinois, but we did win through a campaign that I worked with a tax credit program to try to expand school choice here. So that's been a lot of my burden. But because we're in ministry and doing the thing that we do, we kind of figured we wouldn't be able to pay for a private school for even one kid, and knowing that we wanted to have multiple children, private school can start to rack up pretty quickly. And so my wife, being she was a classroom teacher when we got married, and started to really explore the idea of homeschooling before we had kids. And so when we had our first daughter, I think it was pretty easy for us to make the call that we were going to homeschool, and we did. We started homeschooling our first daughter, who is about to be 12 years old. We now have 5 kids, and all of them are homeschooled. And my wife actually runs a learning center for homeschool families now down the south side and south suburbs.
Well, that's very interesting. Can you give us the rundown on your family, your wife's name, and your kids?
Yeah, so my wife is the one and only Aziza Butler. She's the most amazing human being that I know, quite literally, and just amazing in so many ways. And then we have 5 kids. Azaria, she's about to be 12. Corbin's going to be 10 this year. Azadi is 8. Christopher Anthony is 6. And we have Azim, who is 1. He was born in November of 21.
Wow. So one or both of you are really busy right now.
Yeah, I'm sitting here doing a podcast about homeschooling, and my wife is actually teaching the kids.
Yeah. So you sound like a somewhat similar background to me. My wife was a certified teacher when we got married as well. And the reason we homeschool is after we got engaged, she said, when we have kids, we're going to homeschool them. So I had come out of the military and hadn't really been involved with families much. And I kind of could discern what homeschooling means from context, but I honestly didn't really know too much about it. And since it seemed like it was a make or break thing, I said, okay, sure, we'll do that. And then eventually I had to make good on the promise, and the rest is history, I guess, for us. So tell me, so you say Aziza runs a learning center. What's that like? What does that all involve?
Yeah, so it's called WeSchool Academy, and really she started the learning center to help folks, take a step into that, so that you have a space where you can bring your kids in to get some of that kind of like kid-to-kid social interaction, have some support for mom and dad in terms of what does this look like to decide what to teach, how to teach, and all those types of things. And so it started as this kind of an equipping thing, but then when COVID came, and I think there was already a trend where people were really, especially, and I'm going to just be candid, like Black folks on the south side of Chicago were already starting to think about homeschooling as an alternative, because a lot of the other options just didn't seem viable for kids. But when COVID came and folks had their kids at home because the schools were closed, I think a lot more people began to see how much more doable homeschool really is than it might seem if you're not a person who does it. And so more folks started to do it, and now more folks are accessing this learning center because it's a few days a week where you can bring your kid. Kid actually stays, so it's not like a co-op because the parents don't stay, the kids stay, and they get coursework, they get extracurricular, music, language, that kind of stuff. And it's growing, it's working well. Probably the big challenge right now is capacity. We don't really have capacity for all of the folks who really want to access the support.
Yeah, this is a new trend that's kind of, I'm aware of several places around the country, some that started before COVID and some since COVID. And the universal thing I hear from anyone who's trying to do this is the space, to have, and many of them are growing so fast that they're outgrowing the space that they were in and looking for new space. What kind of resources do you have to run this learning center?
Yeah, I think we have the unique blessing of pastoring a church, so we do this in the church facility, and so we have a few classrooms and the children's space and the youth space and the fellowship hall. So we've got a lot of physical space. It's more the people capacity right now that we're looking at. And I think, that's just a unique blessing. I think, if I were going to try to do this in any context, I probably would try to partner with the church, honestly. But, pastoring the church, that partnership is baked in. So,
yeah. What challenges do you guys face in ministering to your community in this learning center?
So, I mean, I would say capacity again, because it is a little bit, I don't want to be overly dramatic and say like heartbreaking, but it definitely tugs at you every time you have to tell a family that you don't have room for them. Beyond that, it's probably the big challenge is the kind of homeschool splaining that I'm sure you and so many in your audience are very familiar with. People asking questions about well, what curriculum do you use in socialization and this type of thing, even though you don't know what curriculum the school is using. Like, what's the name of that curriculum? And it's so that's kind of a hurdle. Is kind of trying to shake the kind of like weird motif in the community, like we're a weird family, we're making our kids weird, and all that type of thing.
Well, the challenges that families are facing in the public schools, not just in the south side of Chicago, but all over the country, include, I mean, you mentioned this, that during the COVID times, parents got two kind of new exposures that people who wouldn't have thought about homeschooling in the past both saw what it was like to have their kids at home and kind of liked it, and also got a window into what was going on in the public schools that was, maybe the first time that they really saw with more clarity what was going on. Which of those two things do you think motivates the people that you're serving?
I think it's about half and half, right? It's that I think first that experience of it's kind of dope to have my kid around me. Like I like my kids, and if there's a way to have them around without shortchanging them on learning, maybe that might be something that we would explore. But also, I think a lot of folks are concerned, frankly, about some of the, I guess you would call socialization, the values orientation of a lot of what's happening in the public schools, and I try to stay out of those like intense debates, but I can tell you there are just a lot of families who are concerned about that. But also even the academics, right? Like I think people also got to see that my kid is smarter than the material. And I think that's because in these large school districts especially, you end up teaching to the lowest common denominator. And that doesn't always sit well with every family. So I think the folks who are both involved with us directly and just other homeschooling families that we engage with, those things are there. And I can tell you those things are also present with a lot of families in the church, in the community that we engage with, who still have their kids in traditional school settings, but are still trying to find ways to augment those realities.
You mentioned that many of the people you serve are Black people. There's been an enormous growth, like a disproportionately high growth in homeschooling circles amongst Black families. Are you seeing it in your area? And if so, how do you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was something that I was writing about again pre-COVID. Just the kind of massive uptick, and like you said, you saw it across the country, but we were seeing it right here with our own two eyes. I think there are a number of things about this. Number one, families began to see that the schools were probably not the best place to orient their children culturally and academically, right? When schools, let me say what I mean by that. When school becomes a place to like sit down, be quiet, and listen, that's not the best place for like an 8-year-old boy.
Any 8-year-old
and so,
boy.
Right. And so I think folks began to see, especially inside of the Black community, that some of this stuff that was being kind of like tagged as a as a discipline problem. It wasn't a discipline problem. It was a structure problem with the school, right? Like, you're telling these young kids, to sit at a desk for hours and hours, which is something, frankly, Jim, that we don't do. Like, even like when you like work a job, you get lunch breaks. You're talking to the person in the office in the cubicle next to you. There's a lot more like interaction, back and forth, conversation, physical movement, even in the working environment. And we're full-grown adults. It is completely unfair to ask children to just sit and listen and learn. Is not the best place. So that was one thing that was driving it. The academics were going through the floor. And you see, school districts that have, dismal graduation rates, and even the folks who graduate are not prepared for career, not prepared for college. And so that started to rub folks the wrong way. And then there is a values piece. Like, I do think there is a large segment of the Black community that would rather pass forward the values that we received from our parents and grandparents than to see those values intercepted by a school district. It's one thing, even if we decide to change that, right? But to see that kind of like tradition of passing forward values intercepted by a school district, sometimes even without your knowledge, is something that I think rubbed a lot of families the wrong way. And so I think people started to do this, and as Black folks got more exposed to homeschooling, which I think when I was growing up, to be frank, like, homeschooling was like something that white people do. And I think as people started to see it modeled in different communities, also seeing it modeled in more urban settings, right? Because even Black folks who I knew who homeschool, like, it was because they were, way out in the suburbs, and it was just like a very different thing. But to know that people of color, people in right in the city, were doing this, it just becomes, the evidence becomes greater and greater, and I think a snowball effect starts to take place. And these are some of the things that I'm seeing. I haven't done this big sociological research, but this is what I'm seeing in the day-to-day and conversations with people.
So you pastor a church, and your resource center is kind of, sounds like it's an outreach of your church as well. Amongst the people you serve, how important is Christian? How important are Christian values and Christian beliefs in their decision to homeschool and participate with you?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, it's very central to that decision to homeschool, and very central to the decision to do it here, because we do keep our programming very Christ-centered. But there are a few folks who participate who I don't know that they would even identify as Christians. But I mean, I think folks just see the quality of what we're doing. Kind of appreciate the values and the character development, even if that's not necessarily their faith tradition, so to speak. So I think most people are factoring that in a big way, but there are a handful of folks who have participated who don't have that as kind of a core value.
How do you guys navigate that? We help a lot of groups around the country, and some groups want to be everybody kind of on the same page. Other groups want to serve the community at large, and they run their program according to, say, a statement of faith or Christian values, but they welcome kind of all comers. And then there's a lot of variations on that theme between the two. How do you guys navigate that?
Yeah, I think for us it's very important to have one, be very clear about what we're doing, right? Like, I wouldn't want anybody to get involved with this and then, sort of find out through the back door that, like, oh, you're praying with the kids and reading Bible. I would never have put them in there. So you got to be like really upfront and very clear about what we're doing. The second piece is that we do set a standard in terms of kind of behavior and engagement. And again, the model is not like, this is not going to be where, like, oh, you're a discipline problem if you can't sit down for 6 straight hours and look at a textbook. But we do have a basic standard for behavior inside of the space that the kids are expected to maintain, the parents are expected to reinforce. And I really think those two things keep it on the rails. It helps to produce the quality, and I think that the longer we go and the more quality we produce, the easier that whole conversation becomes, because at some point parents just want the best kind of environment and opportunity for their kids.
How much do you guys help the parents? So you provide extracurricular and music and things like that. How much support do you give them for kind of the meat and potatoes homeschooling that goes on outside of your center?
So I think we provide a lot of that. I mean, my wife does most of that. But she's constantly talking to the parents, about the kind of core curricular subjects and sort of walking them through both where their kid seems to be, exercises, different materials that they might be able to explore. And from what I observe, and I'll be honest, I'm glad my kids are homeschooled, because I'll probably not be a great public school parent, because I'm a little removed sometimes from all that stuff. But I do see in the community, not just my wife giving out resources, but just folks sharing that kind of information, what's working, resources that they discover, programs that we might be able to incorporate for any of the kids. So I think that there's a ton of support. My wife kind of takes on being a teacher in the community, and does a lot of instruction, spends a lot of time with parents. And then there's the sharing that happens, which I think is a very rich dynamic.
Mm-hmm. That's something that I think a lot of people who maybe aren't as familiar with homeschooling don't really understand or take into account. I mean, no law made you guys do this. No government official is checking up on you and making sure that you're doing it well. But you created a place for community to organically grow, right? So this sharing amongst the parents and with your wife, and bringing people in kind of voluntarily to do things, it ends up growing a thing that we often, you talked about sociological studies. We talk a lot today about how the fabric of society is sort of fraying at the edges, where faith, family, and community aren't as important or as strong as they once were. But these kinds of things, like what you're doing, are rebuilding those things organically and voluntarily amongst people. I gather most of the people are kind of from your neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a broader geography, the south side and south suburbs. So it's a pretty wide geography, but that's where our folks come from.
And did I say anything that made sense to you? Is it creating a sense of community that's apart from sort of the traditional, go to the elementary school kind of community?
Yeah, I think it is. And one of the things that I try to point out whenever I get the opportunity, because I try to keep decorum. I don't want to be a nuisance to anyone. But whenever I get the opportunity, I try to point out to folks that this is actually where public school comes from, right? At the core of the concept of public schooling, it wasn't necessarily the idea that the state should run schools, but more the idea that the populace should be educated, and that people should come together to provide education, training, and development for children within a community. Now, that got institutionalized into what we see as public school. But even if we could try to actually get our minds around what we're supposed to be as a democracy, this is not those people over there, down at the school board providing something to the community, right? Like, this is a community asset that we're supposed to create together. right? So that's even, before we had kids. And in my advocacy work, a big part of that was organizing and advocating for parents to be much more part of the fabric of schools, because school, even in the public school dynamic, is not supposed to be separate from that fabric of the community and the family. And so I definitely think that we're recreating something that feels outside of where the public schools are now. But I would like to think that it's a model for something that the public schools should be trying to move closer toward what we have, because that's in essence what they're supposed to be.
So what's your elevator pitch for when a parent or a couple come to you and say, I'm not happy with what's going on down at the school. Why should I look into homeschooling?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a better relationship for you and your kid, right? That's your kid. Nobody knows your kid like you do. 2, don't let anybody trick you into thinking that teaching your kid is impossible for you to do. And 3, especially if you partner up with something like WeSchool, and I say something like WeSchool because it doesn't have to be WeSchool, but there's a ton of support for doing this. Most people think homeschool, so that's the end of the elevator pitch. But the reason I close with that is that a lot of people think that homeschool is something that you do by yourself. And you, Jim, you probably know way more homeschooling families than I do, but I literally don't know any homeschooling family that sees themselves as on a journey alone, just me and my little house doing my little thing. It's everybody I know is doing it in some kind of way. They're doing it in community.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. I wrote an article some years ago talking about that, how the homeschooling movement is much more than family by family. And with your interest in civics and civic engagement, I actually called the article "The Civic Virtue of Private Homeschooling." That homeschooling, through the kind of thing you just described in your area, builds a community that's good for kids, it's good for families, and it's good for the country. It's good for your neighborhoods. It's good for the community. So I'm really excited about what you're doing up there. Do you ever get contacted by other pastors or people that are looking into setting up a similar thing through their church or in their community?
Only once. I don't think that what we're doing is like noised abroad in a massive kind of way. But I did get reached out to once about trying to do something like this, and tried to be whatever encouragement I could.
Well, so if people wanted to reach out to you, would you be accessible and willing to give out your contact information? How can people get a hold of you? Because what you're doing is kind of a big deal, and it's happening, all over the country in little fits and starts. And I just know there's a lot of interest in, how do I help my community get more people to choose homeschooling? So how can people get a hold of you or Aziza?
Yeah, so you can certainly email me. My email is chris@cecnetwork.church. That's Chris at Charles Echo Charles Network.church. You can also find me on Twitter at Chris the Citizen, and hit me up there. I'm going to look. I don't know my wife's email at the school by heart, so I'm going to look it up. Aziza at WeSchoolAcademy.com. Aziza at WeSchoolAcademy.com. And I'm sure she would also be glad to hear from folks, because we're both very, very passionate about this.
Yeah. Well, and I'd be interested, once this goes live, hearing back from you to see if anybody actually reached out. I kind of hope you get deluged with inquiries, because I think what you're doing is great. So I have 2 questions, and I'm going to save the best one for last. My first question is this is the not best question. How did you feel about your foray into electoral politics?
A lot of mixed feelings about that. I've been around campaigns a lot in my life, but this is my first time being a candidate. Um, I'm honestly still not sure how I feel about that. It would have been an easier decision had we won. Um, it certainly clarified some things for me, though, just about partisanship and partisan politics in our country, but also in the region where I am. Those clarifications were sobering. I think I grew up because I started in politics when I was like 12 years old. I started hanging around politics, and in those times there was a world where you could much more easily be pro school choice, pro life, and be a Democrat, like solid Democrat in the party. Obviously, differences with a lot of folks, but it didn't feel like that running in the Democratic primary this time, and I think that's very, very unfortunate.
Well, so this is the most important question, perhaps the most important question of the entire podcast: Cubs or White Sox?
Easily White Sox.
Yeah,
even though I have to say, we do school pictures, and my son, my oldest son, took his school picture in a Cubs jersey.
Oh no!
So we still have some things on kind of character development that we're working on.
Yeah, I'd be suspicious. So I grew up as an American League fan, but then so this is how old I am. When they adopted the designated hitter, I went over to the National League, and now I got nowhere to go. So, well, listen, I'm going to leave the last word to you. I really appreciate your time and your insights. And what final words would you have for people who are already homeschooling, considering outreach programs to their neighborhood, anything at all that occurs to you?
Yeah, one, just want to say thank you, Jim, for having me on. This has been a great experience, and thank you for the work that you do. It's very important to this movement, and that's what I would say to folks. Is I really think that there is a growing movement of people who are thinking differently about how to educate their children. And I would say whether you're doing it now or whether you're considering it, just know that one, there's absolutely nothing wrong or deficient about thinking differently about how you educate your kids. There was a day in this world where there was no such thing as a public school district. Somebody thought it up, people bought into it, it grew. And the same thing can happen for this type of movement. And there's a ton of support. You're not the only one out there doing it. So if this is something that you feel called to, I would say jump in. The water's fine.
Yeah, those are good words. I really appreciate that a lot. It's kind of our mission to preach that gospel of homeschooling as well. That there's so many resources and so many people out there willing to help, and you don't have to believe the lies that you can't do it, because I could do it. Now I had my wife. Now that let's be honest. But it's a great experience if you're inclined to do it. There is some cost to it, and there's some sacrifice. You have to be willing to pour into it. But if you are, it's a great place to be. So my guest today is Chris Butler. He's a pastor, and he and his wife run a resource center called WeSchool in south side of Chicago. Been great having you today, Chris. And for those of you interested in the work of HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, you can visit us at our website at hslda.org. Become a member, support our work, or make a donation to support our work. And a big part of our work is supporting homeschool groups out there like the one that Chris and his wife run. So thanks again, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Every week, HSLDA hears from hundreds of homeschool families, many of whom are facing hostility from school officials or discrimination from colleges and employers. We've helped single parents facing criminal charges for homeschooling their children. families traumatized by wrongful CPS investigations, and even a grandmother harassed by the state for homeschooling her granddaughter. By donating to HSLDA, you can help make homeschooling possible for families like these and enable our work to preserve freedom for future generations. Give today at hslda.org/donate. That's hslda.org/donate. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.